What's going on, guys? Doomwake here, although I certainly don't look like Doomwake. Welcome back to another episode of Watching the Meta. You'll notice that there appears to be something missing from my face. I don't exactly know where I put it, but in any case, we are going to get started with another episode of Watching the Meta. First and foremost, if you're new to this series, every single week we take a look at the Magic Online challenges as well as some high-level paper events. Specifically this week, we have a modern showcase on Magic Online, and then as well as the Pioneer Regional Championship and a standard SCG 10K. Some different events besides just the weekly challenges. We kind of take a look at the metagame, see where it is evolving, where are things going from here, and then some interesting deck lists to highlight for each format. But as always, we are going to start today's episode off with Modern. And as you can see on your screen, not really a lot changed, and I don't expect that to be the case for at least a couple more weeks up until the point where we have that elusive December ban announcement where hopefully some things will change, because as far as the Modern format is concerned, Boros Energy is a fine deck to be this highly represented, 25.9%. If you include Mardu, that's roughly around 36% of the format is energy decks. And, for all intents and purposes, the energy decks are fair decks. The gameplay is reasonably good. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of interaction. Granted, a lot of the games come down to one specific card that may or may not cost 4 mana and may or may not draw you a bunch of cards in Time Walk. But other than that, the gameplay is pretty good. As far as the rest of the metagame is concerned, it's mostly the same. There's a significant dip in Belcher, I guess. That is something that's worth highlighting. Mardu, Oculus, Ruby Storm, Broodscale. These numbers are roughly the same. A little bit of a downtick in Domain, a little bit of an uptick in Tron, a little bit of an uptick in Gorios. There is a specific printing from Foundations, which, by the way, this is the first week of Watching the Meta with Foundations. Now, the set certainly has more of an impact on some formats than others. We'll get into that. But Esper Gorios, there's a reason for the uptick. And then Living End, not really sure what the surge in Living End is for. Let me know in the comment section down below. But from the deck list that I saw, there wasn't really any new innovations for Living End. It's just people decided that it was a good weekend to play it, I guess. But yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, mostly the same as what we've been looking at. But as we talked about, Foundations is making an impact on multiple formats, and that is going to be the highlight for the decklist that we are looking at today. And the first decklist that we got definitely has some Foundations cards in it. Before we continue, just for posterity's sake, I did want to mention the challenge winners for this weekend were Belcher, the Grinding Breach deck, Blue-Black Oculus, 2 Boros Energy, Dimir Mill, and then Amulet Titan, which won the Showcase Challenge. So keep that in mind when we're going through these deck lists. But the first deck list that I want to show you here is Esper Gorios. Now, you might, at first pass, you might think to yourself, this deck looks pretty similar to what we've been used to before, where Emperor of Bones and Gorios Vengeance is ways to reanimate creatures, ways to discard like Tainted Indulgence and Psychic Frog. But we have a couple of new cards here, most notably Kiora the Rising Tide, which is a fantastic card because it is a way to get large creatures into the graveyard, but it's also, in and of itself, a separate win condition. Now, it is a little bit tricky because it does utilize the graveyard, so it is still sort of weak to those graveyard hate cards like Rest in Peace, Nihil Spellbomb, you name it, all that Soul Guide Lantern, all that kind of stuff. But it at least gives you something to force their hand. Like, you can fill your graveyard with a bunch of non-creatures, force them to use their graveyard hate, and then say, okay, discard my Atraxa. In this case, my Ulamog. There's no Atraxas in this deck, which is interesting. But yeah, a lot of the similar stuff, just a slightly different top end. There's also 2 Coma World Eater, another new card from Foundations here. It is an 8/12. Whenever it hits them, you get 4 3/3s. And because Gorios Vengeance gives haste, you can turn 2, attack for 8, make 4 3/3s. That's pretty good. So interesting take on Gorios Vengeance here as the first deck that we're taking a look at. Next up, we have here from The Nectar, which is a name that I'm becoming more and more familiar with, and I keep seeing them do well with these really interesting affinity decks. And today is no different. This is a 9th place finish, where a little bit different than what we've seen before. I've seen some lists that have Tamiya meets the Story Circle to ditch your hand and make a bunch of clue tokens. But here, none of those. We're utilizing Case of the Filched Falcon, which is a 1-mana enchantment that makes a clue, and then if you have 3 or more artifacts, you solve it, and then you can basically like a 3-mana install artifact type thing. Portable Hole as your removable Springleaf Drum to have some mana acceleration. Your payoffs here are 4 Thought Monitor, only 2 Kappa Cannoneer, which is kind of interesting. And the Reality Chip, which is one we don't see very often as well. Shout out to the Enigma Jewel, really sweet card. It's basically a Soul Ring, but you can only use it for activated abilities. Just so happens that you have a card that has a pretty good activated ability for 2 mana, as well as, it's not the only, you can equip the Reality Chip, I guess, which could come up, and Case of the Filch Falcon too, so a couple of ways to utilize the Jewel. But yeah, just wanted to keep shouting out the Nectar for making these really sweet Affinity decks, and I love Affinity, so keep on keeping on. And speaking of blasts from the past, Cardboard Crack Addict had one heck of a weekend. This list that I'm showing you is in 14th place. I believe they had 2 other finishes with Infect, and it was the same person every time. If you looked at an Infect deck from 6-7 years ago, right up until before Gitaxian Probe was banned, it would pretty much look exactly like this. I mean, maybe you take the IG off of the hierarchy, you take those first 2 letters off, and maybe you'll get to the same conclusion. But this is just plucked from 2017. Now, the one thing that I will mention about this Infect deck is they do play 4 copies of Phyrexian Crusader in the main deck, and protection from red and white, pretty good spot to be in the format right now. But other than that, it's just kind of your usual fare. There is a slightly new card here for Venerated Rotpriest from a couple of years ago, but very good card with all of your pump spells, because every time you cast a pump spell, you get an extra poison counter, and they do stack. So if you have multiple Rotpriests, each pump spell is that more poison counters. But yeah, Might of Old Krosa, Mutagenic Growth, Royal Treatment is kind of your protection spell where it gives your creature hexproof and then you put a roll on it, which gives the creature +1/+1 and ward 1. Spell Pierce, Finds of Vastwood, even 4 scale up. So really just business as usual, but I think the important thing to highlight is a deck that has the capability of playing 4 Phyrexian Crusader. You can't really go wrong with that card right now. And last but not least, we have What Up in 29th place, where this is sort of boom bust, blue-red. So some things going on here. So Boom Bust is a card. Most of the time, you're going to be casting it for the 2 mana half, which is 2 mana, destroy a land you control and a land you don't control. But if you happen to have indestructible lands like Darksteel Citadel or Silver Bluff Bridge, then you targeting your own land is not going to destroy it. So it's effectively just turns Boom Bust into a 2 mana Stone Rain. Similar thing with Cleansing Wildfire, not quite a Stone Rain, but if you Wildfire your own Citadel, you get to ramp, you don't lose your land, and you still draw the card. So it's Rampant Growth plus draw a card. You have ways to turn your artifacts into creatures, specifically, if I can find it, Rise and Shine. Only 1 copy here of Rise and Shine. These decks, I think, in the past did play in Soul Artifact, but that is not present in What Up's deck. But we do have the One Rings. I mean, it's modern. We're playing the One Ring. One interesting thing that's worth noting about this deck is it is a Karn deck list, where you have Cleansing Wildfire to sort of ramp you a little bit, so you have ways to get additional land drops, and Sundering Eruption sort of in a similar vein as well. So you have enough ways to generate mana to then get you to Karn. You have a bunch of Karn targets in the sideboard, so interesting deck list here. A little bit overshadowed by the One Ring, but hey, that's modern, at least for the next couple of weeks. All right, next format to discuss is the format that seems to not have a ton of support right now, as we just towards the end of the regional championship cycle. That is Pioneer, of course, where, I mean, the metagame did notice some pretty huge shifts. Last week, Rakdos Prowess was 17%. This week, it's not even, it's the 5th or 6th most played deck at 5.5%. So huge dip there, a pretty big increase in Rakdos Demons. Phoenix about the same, small downtick in Junsac, little small uptick in Company, Grow Prowess, things like that. The one thing I will mention, there's a couple of notable shifts here. 5-color Enigmatic, huge jump this week. I'm not exactly sure. So I will mention that the Enigmatic decks do have Zur, but the decks you see on here at the bottom where it says 5-color Zur Overlords, those are 60-card decks that are just all in on Zur. The Enigmatic decks, sometimes they have Zur, sometimes they don't, but they do have their 80 cards with Enigmatic, so that's kind of the difference there. So more people wanting to play Enigmatic. And then Boros Burn, 3.1%, basically non-existent last week. Again, it's got something to do with the release of Foundations. We're not going to go over the Boros Burn decks because we're going to spend so much time on them in Standard, and To be honest with you, they're a little bit different, but for the most part, they're roughly the same. I do have just one this week, spicy deck list for you to take a look at for Pioneer. And that spicy deck list is the one in front of you. Again, this episode is really all about foundations, and the only card outside of the burn decks that have Bolt Wave, but I mean, it's really hard to mess up a burn deck. But Odin's here in 31st place has decided to show us what we can do with Leyline Axe, which is a powerful new card where it's a leyline. If it's in your opening hand, you can start the game with it on the battlefield. It's a 4-mana equipment, and the equip cost is 3, and it gives a creature +1/+1, double strike, and trample. Now, the powerful interaction here is if you're pairing Leyline Axe with Fervent Champion. Shout out to Javier Dominguez, world champion. I don't know if we're going to be able to top Fervent Champion with this new card, but if you have Leyline Axe on turn 0 and you go Fervent Champion on turn 1, you can then equip the axe for 0 and hit them for 4 on the very first turn. Leyline Axe, also a powerful card with something like Ensoul Artifact, where it gives you a free thing to put onto the battlefield, then just go turn 2 Ensoul Artifact. Good to go. Also, Leyline Axe on turn 0, turn 1, Goblin Tomb Raider. You already have an artifact to give it +1/+0 and haste. So there's a lot of cool synergies and interesting things you can do with the Leyline Axe. So I like this approach. I kind of want to try Leyline Axe with Metalwork Colossus, because Axe being a 4-mana artifact lets you discount the Colossus quite a bit. But that's for when we get Pioneer Masters on Arena. But for now, if you are interested in Pioneer, this is probably a cool place to start. Before I let you go for Pioneer, I just wanted to, for posterity's sake, again, there was a regional championship this past weekend that was won by Rakdos Demons, and then the 3 challenges that I have were won by Enigmatic, Boros Burn, and Rakdos Prowess. And now for the reason that you're all here right now. Well, maybe some of you at home are here for. This is the first week of results in Standard with Foundations, and we've talked about on this episode so far about Foundations' impact. It's had a very, very minimal impact on Modern, even less in Pioneer, but Standard feels like almost a completely different format, and that's why I enjoy the Standard rotations and the new sets so much, where you look at a metagame from a week before, and like, for example, look at these 2 graphs. Like the numbers are all over the place in terms of new decks popping up and metagame shares and all that stuff. So a lot to talk about for Standard. Now, starting off, maybe where we left off, Dimir midrange, Golgari midrange, those are the 2 most played decks in the format. Last week, Golgari was actually only 4th. This week, it's 1st, clocking in at 16.9. And then second place, Dimir midrange, 16.3. They're pretty close enough to each other. So about a third of the format is being taken up by Dimir and or Golgari. And that's a lot. It is a lot of mid-range decks, but they do play out pretty differently. Dimir is a little bit more aggressive, low to the ground, cheap flyers. Golgari now introducing Llanowar Elves, which is a huge printing for the Golgari decks. Basically, every single Golgari list that I saw had 4 Elves. So that is a very big printing for them. One thing I want to mention here, look at Gruul Prowess. Last week, 10.9%. This week, nowhere to be seen. A very minuscule 1.3%. And I think a lot of that has to do with, look at the left-hand side of the graph, where Boros Prowess, nowhere to be seen last week, just what didn't exist, and now it is 12.5% of the metagame. That's the 3rd most played deck. For a deck that didn't exist last week, that is Foundations in a nutshell. Deck got a lot of new tools with Boros Charm, Bolt Wave, Burst Lightning. Just that is the deck that probably gained the single most from Foundations, and it shows in the metagame share. 5-color Overlords, roughly the same. Oculus, Temur Prowess, roughly around the same. Mono-white tokens, huge uptick, and I think that makes a lot of sense because if the mid-range decks are doing well, the natural predator to the mid-range decks is mono-white tokens. There was actually a mono-white tokens mirror match in the finals of the SCG that took place this weekend. So that is definitely, if you're looking to beat up on these mid-range players, you could do a lot worse than mono-white. And then rounding out the rest of the metagame, nothing too crazy in terms of shifts. The Jeskai Convoke, slight uptick, and then everything else is roughly around the same. So that is kind of the big picture of what the metagame looks like, but I have a lot of sweet deck lists to show you guys. And what better place to start with than the best combo deck in Standard, ? Free Education in 4th place of one of the challenges. This deck also got 9th place in the SCG, little bit of a different list, but I wanted to showcase this one because I think this one looks a little bit cleaner, although the other version did have Greed's Gambit, so keep in mind that there's big differences there. But Demonic Pact and Harmless Offering is a combo we had in Standard previously. To the best of my knowledge, let me know in the comment section below if I'm misremembering things. I'm bound to do that from time to time, but I don't think it saw a ton of play the first time it was legal in Standard. People tried it, but it wasn't super great. But a big part of why I think this deck actually does have legs this time is Beseech the Mirror. It works so perfectly in this deck, where not only if you have the Demonic Pact in play, if you have something else to sacrifice on, say that you've used the first three modes, you can then go Beseech the Mirror, sack something else, go get the Harmless Offering. If they don't have mana or interaction up, there you go. You just Harmless Offering, give them the Pact, and they lose. It is also extremely important to be able to have a sacrifice outlet that doesn't need a spell to resolve. So against stuff like counter spells, even if they're holding up counter magic to counter your Harmless Offering, well, you can just say, okay, Beseech, sacrifice my Pact if I'm about to lose to it. You don't care if they counter the Beseech because you've removed the Pact from the battlefield, and that's all that matters. So huge printing for this deck. It's utilizing an enchantment sacrifice theme with like Hopeless Nightmare, Disturbing Mirth, powerful in the sacrifice shells, some other enchantments like Bitter Reunion and Tiny Bones joins up, and then some interaction, Go for the Throat, Torch the Tower, Duress, Final Vengeance as well. That's another way to sacrifice Beseech. So a lot of cool stuff going on, and I really do think that there's a lot of space to explore with these Demonic Pact plus Harmless Offering decks. And speaking of new cards, they just keep on coming. Jesus returned in 32nd place. This deck also, I think, took 4th place by Screenwriter New York in one of the other challenges, but I have this one. It's actually, I think, the exact same list, maybe like 1 or 2 cards different. So shout out to Screenwriter. I don't know who, which came first, the apple or the egg or something like that, however that saying goes. But in any case, Zombify here. Zombify is really our first 4-mana reanimation spell. Now, you might actually me and say, well, did you know about Rite of the Moth? Now, Rite of the Moth did exist before, but it's awkward because it gives the creature a finality counter, which is not quite as good as Zombify. But similar vein here, where Zombify is your main reanimation spell, you have discard outlets like Fear of Missing Out, where 2 mana, 2/3, you get to discard a card, draw a card. If you get to Delirium, which this deck can do, you have creature, enchantment, instant, land, and sorcery. So you have some ways to get Delirium. Bitter Reunion and Elder Dragon War, along with Bitter Triumph. So plenty of ways to discard our creatures. Now, Atraxa, you're probably used to. You know what that card does. Coma World Eater, maybe not one that you're so familiar with. Another new card from Foundations. I think I like this better than Valgavoth because Ward 4 is pretty dang close to Ward Sacrifice 3 non-land permanents. Like, it's very, very hard to kill a Coma on turn 4 because the only kill spells for it cost 2 mana, which means they have to pay 6. And if you're doing this on your 4th turn, even if you're on the draw, they still can't go for the Throated. So you're guaranteed to get at least one hit in. So I think I like Coma more than Valgavoth, but that's interesting debate there. You could split those. And then the other interaction, Cut Down, Duress, there's a Push Pull in here as a removal spell that is also a 6-mana reanimate, so a little bit of flexibility there. Just a really cool looking deck list, and I think there is a lot of space to explore with Zombify. And speaking of ways to explore with Zombify, here is another one. Now, this one is blue-black from DSK Beowulf in 10th place. I know, I could say that. DSK Beowulf, 10th place. This is blue-black Reanimator. So similar-ish concept where you're utilizing the black interaction like Duress and Cut Down alongside Bitter Triumph as a discard outlet to pair with Zombify. Now, instead of the red alternative discard outlets, we're using blue ones. So there's a couple of cool ones here. Kiora, which we saw in the modern Goryo's deck. Similar idea here. Way to discard Valgavoth Terror Eater into the graveyard, but also if you can get the Threshold, which pretty easy in this deck, you have a lot of ways to mill, then you can have an additional threat as well. You have Picklock Prankster. Speaking of mill, Picklock Prankster and Founding the Third Path are both ways to mill over cards to help find Valgavoth or fuel Kiora. And then your other sort of selection spells in Moment of Truth, which is kind of cool because Moment of Truth digs you to the Zombify while also putting Valgavoth into the graveyard. Similar thing with something like Picklock Prankster. Mill 4, find a Zombify, mill Valgavoth, go from there. So, like I said, a ton of space to explore in this Zombify archetype, and I don't think we've seen the last of Zombify yet. Like I said, I don't think we've seen the last of Zombify yet. I promise. Okay, I know you're probably sick of Zombify now, but I promise, last one. We'll spend less time on this one. This is Esper Reanimator by Ryan Bellamy, who made top 16 of the SCG in Columbus this past weekend. So this is more of like an Esper control deck, where yes, it has Atraxa and Valgavoth to reanimate and put into the graveyard, but it's not playing Zombify. It's actually playing Rite of the Moth instead, which is kind of interesting. But I think the theory here is that you have a lot more ways to control the battlefield, and you just want the flashback on this more than the turn 4 Zombify. Here's some big thing that you can't beat. You'll notice there's less Valgavoths and there's no copies of Coma. And it's more of, like I said, an Esper control deck. You're playing a lot more counter spells, no more lies, 3 steps ahead, which is cool because it's a counter spell and a discard enabler for your large creature. We're playing main deck Wraths, 3 Day of Judgment, and a Sunfall, and a lot more interactions. The other reason I think that this individual chose Rite of the Moth over something like Zombify is you can actually discard Rite of the Moth to the 3 steps ahead, get a little bit of value that way, make sure that you're still able to interact up the curve. So last Reanimator deck, I promise. We got 2 more decks for you, but shout out to Ryan Bellamy for Esper. So we talked a little bit about mono white tokens, where, mono white tokens is a deck that is preying on these mid-range decks. But what if I told you that you can actually put the best card in Foundations into the mono white tokens deck? And here we have 9th place from DB_Ilgorzone with Celestia tokens. And this is really a lot of what the mono white deck is doing. Not quite as many card advantage engines. So the mono white deck typically plays Caretaker's Talent and Enduring Innocence. There is no Enduring Innocence in this deck list. But instead of that, we're utilizing the maximum number of Overlord of the Hauntwoods and Overlord of the Mistmoors. And I think the reasoning for playing maximum Overlords in this version is the acceleration that you get from Llanowar Elves. If you go turn 1 Elf, turn 2 Impending Overlord of the Hauntwoods, that's 5 mana on turn 3. There's a lot of things you can do with that. And you can cast Mistmoors a lot earlier in this deck as well. The other reason we're playing a bunch of Overlords is green also gives you the best card advantage spell in the format, which is Up the Beanstalk. So, scratch what I said about Enduring Innocence earlier. We have a better Enduring Innocence with Up the Beanstalk, which gets triggered off of Hauntwoods, Mistmoors, etc., etc. But just wanted to highlight this as sort of a different way to play the mono white token deck if you're kind of into the green splash, maybe being a little bit faster against those red decks with Elf into Hauntwoods. Like, those draws are extremely fast. So just something to consider if you're a tokens enjoyer. And last but certainly not least, I couldn't leave you guys hanging without another Llanowar Elf deck, and this is probably my favorite one that I've seen so far. Elves, huge player in the Golgari midrange decks and in tokens, as we just saw, but this is as clean as it gets. This is mono green aggro. Not a ton of new cards, but probably the single most important printing for a deck like this that this deck could ever hope to get in Llanowar Elves. There is also 2 Sirach the Huntcaller, a fantastic throwback. This was one of my favorite standard cards of all time, and I played a little bit of mono green with it, maybe not this necessarily this version. I didn't have the best results with it, but shout out to Levi for making top 32 of the SCG. A lot of cool stuff going on. Polukranos to just large green creatures, main deck Frillback, Aloe Alchemist, which is a 2-mana 3/2 trample that gets a little bit of damage in if you plot it. Paw Patch, fantastic 1-drop. So the card quality in this deck is pretty high for a mono green deck. Your cards are reasonably costed and powerful at each stage of the curve. And then a little bit of removal here with Hunter's Talent, Audacity to give Trample, and Snakeskin Veil for protection, excuse me. I will mention there is a couple of Foundations cards in the sideboard, a couple of Vivian Reeds there, which I have seen popping up in Golgari midrange as well. Fantastic card against Unholy Annex, because you can kill the flyer or the Annex itself. So just for posterity's sake, I wanted to highlight the winners of this weekend's standard events. We had the SCG in Columbus and 4 MTGO challenges. The SCG was won by Mono White, and then the 4 challenges were won by Mono White, 5-color Zur, Golgari Midrange, and Blue White Oculus. And that's going to do it for Foundations Week 1 of Watching the Meta. There is a lot of cool stuff to watch out for, most notably in Standard, but there's some other things going on in other formats as well. Again, I hope you guys are enjoying all this Standard content, because I am having an absolute blast trying all these different Foundations decks. And again, I can't thank you guys enough for supporting the channel and helping me along through this journey. So I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Watching the Meta, and until next time, adios.